Hello. All right. Good evening. I want to welcome everyone here to the Lost River Church. If this is your first time visiting with us, it's so nice to have you. Just to provide some context to what's going on out here, we are continuing our class on the book of Mark. And we are nearing the very, very end of that. I think we have one more class after this one. Sterling is talking about something. I bet it's going to be so good, for sure. But I think he's going to be doing a topical study of some kind to kind of close out this trimester. But not sure how you all feel. Trimester's pretty long. Hopefully it hasn't felt too long from your all seats. It has been a joy to do this. And with this being my last class, I wanted to just start by saying thank you all for bearing with me when things don't go right, for being an encouragement to me throughout this class, for participating and making this very big, wide room feel a little smaller when it comes to how this class has gone. So again, just wanted to start by saying thank you for that. We are going to start with a word of prayer. If you would, please bow with me. Our Father in heaven, Lord, we come before you now humbled at your word and your gospel message that you've had for us. As we, as this family, collectively have gone through that story and have seen just how in control you truly are. From the creation of the world to devising a plan to restore your people back to you, this mission that you have been on from the very beginning when sin entered the world. And Lord, we just want to say thank you. Thank you for loving us enough to put this plan together. Thank you for caring enough to want us to return to you. And thank you for giving us a hope. Thank you for giving us something to look forward to past this world here on this earth, where we are constantly reminded of how imperfect it can be and how much better it will be with you. Be with us tonight as we go through this class and help us be safe on our way home, continuing to shine the light of your Son in all that we do. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Alrighty, so with what I was tasked with, similar to Sterling, the approach was very much I don't know, we'll figure it out, which is not always very fun from a teaching perspective. But I thought it would be beneficial, and hopefully you all will too, to just take a second and recap the book. Now, that is not a line by line of what we have covered. This is not rehashing some insane amount of slides. This to me is, I know you can't remember everything from a trimester, but what can you take away from it? What can you take with you, whether that's here, whether that's applying the message to your own life, whether that's sharing it with others? What was this book to you? So we're going to recap for a little bit, and then we're going to actually take just a few moments at the end to have some discussion questions. They're going to be on the PowerPoint. I'll give you time to think them over. I'm not going to put you on the spot. But just hearing from you on this class and what it's meant to you, and hopefully we can get some good things out of it. So the book of Mark was doing some research and trying to properly encapsulate this book, and I found this really interesting quote. It says, on average, only one person in an entire auditorium claims that Mark is their favorite gospel. And if you happen to be here, that was from the Lost River Research Institute, also known as Terry Gary. We started, and I'm happy to throw the teachers under the bus because we're at the end, and what are we going to do about it? When we were assigned this book, we too met in one of the resource rooms, the three of us, and we're like, have you done this before? Have you all sat through a Mark class? Have you taught Mark? And after it was a collective no across the board, it was like, okay, well, why maybe? Like maybe another gospel? We just covered parables and miracles not that long ago. Like why Mark? And we sat and we talked for a long time. And the consensus of this group seemed pretty similar in terms of maybe the attention given to the book, maybe the message and how it lands with you. And so I want to start this by kind of going back to day one and saying, maybe why not Mark, right? What was it for us collectively that maybe prevented us from taking the time to dig into this book? Maybe why did we look elsewhere when talking about the story of Jesus in the gospel? And so to start, I actually think this would be a pro for some of our readers, but it is the shortest of the four gospels. As a non-reader for most of my life, that's usually a good thing about books. But in this case, if you're looking to teach or read or want to find a story, maybe Mark doesn't have it. It's the shortest of the Gospels. We've talked about that. We've talked about kind of where it fits in the timeline. And I think this is a big part of it. Around 90% of Mark's stories are found in either Matthew or Luke. So there's not a lot of stories where you are kind of forced to go to this book to find what you're looking for. So if you've already found a home in Matthew or Luke and you stylistically connect better, maybe that's why we as a group hadn't given it the attention. And then some of the more complicated topics in Mark are talked about elsewhere, but a lot of the times those other authors go into more detail. And I can say, as the person who got stuck teaching about the eternal sin and a few of the other ones, sometimes subjects aren't ones you just want to sit and ruminate with and just really meditate on. And in the book of Mark, when those things are brought up, a lot of the times we don't get the nice bow on top conclusion to make us feel great about what we read. Sometimes you're left struggling with the message. And so maybe that's why you haven't gone here. And then this one I do think might be the best explanation, at least for me. So I hope this makes sense. Maybe it's just less digestible. Maybe it's not the one that's the most comfortable read for you. And that's not an accelerated reading program. Is that what we have here, right? Like different levels for different people, and that's how you connect. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is more of just some people like reading different styles of literature. The way someone writes might connect with you versus something else. And so the way I kind of would describe the other books, right? So Matthew has a real clear structure in my mind. Real clear themes that are kind of intertwined through the stories, how one falls right after the other, pushing the narrative along. Luke, it's one of those things when you feel it, you know, but you don't know how to put it on a PowerPoint. It's like an AP English exam that you actually want to read, right? Like it is written in a very intelligent way. The way he goes about from the beginning in chapter 1, describing what he's witnessed and why he's recording it. And look, if this one isn't landing with you, that's totally fine. But that to me makes sense. The way Luke is written resonates. Maybe that's what you connect with and that's where you go back. And John, I think a favorite of many, many, many people, is so unique and different than the other three. It is written with a very clearly stated purpose at the end of the book, and that's how it's pieced together. So from beginning to end, you know this is John. And then Mark, on the other hand, doesn't always feel that way. So I think the structure of the book tells a lot about the purpose of the book. And this is oversimplifying the book. You guys have sat through 4 months of this. But the first half of Mark is basically saying Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. And think back to the very first class. How does Mark open up? What is the intro to this book, going back to chapter 1? Introduced very clearly. We jump right into it, right, Jay? It's the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We have stated exactly who this person is from the beginning. We jump right into a prophecy, again, validating who he is. That is the first half of the book. It is writing to the people, again, within the timeline here, more than likely, the first gospel being released to the general public. It is letting these people know, many of whom may have lived through it or have heard it from firsthand sources, this is the guy. All that stuff you've heard, this is the guy, and this is who he is. And the whole second half of the book is saying what happened to him and why it happened. So again, it's a simple premise, but when you think that this was probably the first gospel that made its way onto the shelves, we're getting right to the heart of the matter and saying, this is what you need to know. And I think it even ties into the weirdness of how the book ends with this, we won't go all into it again. Jared already got stuck with that. But, it ends with, he is resurrected. It doesn't go on for chapters talking about all of what happened after. It simply states, what he said is going to happen, happened. That's the end. So that is what it is. And again, I think Mark's directness, maybe you all remember the fire hose in the face of a small child that graced the PowerPoint early on. Like, that is Mark. It is direct. It is a whole lot of info at once. But I think there was an intention behind it. And so for me, as I kind of reflect on the book, I'm thinking about the readers. What do you think, or what do you know from reading? Like, what could have been the thoughts of people in this day and age when it came to understanding this Messiah who was going to come? What did they think of this man?
They were expecting a king.
Expecting a king, and what type of king maybe?
An earthly king.
Maybe an earthly king, right? So we have maybe that as a preconceived notion. In terms of his life on earth, how do you expect this king to show up? Royalty. Purple robes, looking the part, and if you were to guess how his story would play out, what would you expect to happen? Right, kind of like Jared's lesson, right? The whole slay the dragon, whatever, like show up, get the job done, take over. This is why I'm here. But that is far from the reality that these people either witnessed or read about. And so I think a lot of Mark's directness is to immediately handle the misconceptions that were probably out there. So you've got this idea that the Messiah came to suffer and die not to overtake empires. That his death was not a failure. It wasn't some triumph from, the political parties. It was a part of the plan. And then again, his life that was nothing like people expected it to be was intentional. And it was there to be an example to all the people following him and all the people following him in years to come. Everything about this man's life was not what people thought it would be. And so again, putting yourself in the initial reader's shoes, they haven't heard the full picture. They aren't given the epistles that we're going to read or have read, and some of them can't read at all. So maybe it makes sense that the book is short because it's being told to people over and over and over. And the goal is, I want you, the listener, to know that Jesus, the Christ, is the Messiah and that he's real. And this is what happened. So I'm going to just completely steal my own slides just to kind of reinforce this, right? The book of Mark, through 15 verses, covers all of this. Not going to read it. Don't have time. That is 15 verses to open the book of Mark. In the other three Gospels, the first 15 verses gets us through the genealogy of Christ almost, talking about John the Baptist being born, introducing this whole incarnate word thing that they needed a lot of time to explain. Like, that's 15 verses in the other Gospels. Mark is a bullet train. He gets started, he gets right where he wants to go, and we keep moving forward. So it's just so different. But again, I think it all is intentional. So things that maybe we viewed as cons to the book, can be viewed as prose. Maybe we can appreciate the book for being intentional in its purpose and being different for a reason, rather than maybe not fitting the cookie cutter mold that we grew accustomed to with some of the other gospels. Maybe that's what Terry was thinking the whole time, and it took me 4 months to figure it out. I don't know. But hopefully you guys have come to see maybe just the intentionality behind it. So in terms of themes in the book of Mark, or just stuff that hopefully we can take away from it, I think it's interesting, and I've already said this, Mark starts by introducing Jesus to his readers and letting them know that he's the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Other gospels were kind of along for the journey as we discover it, as they discover it. But here we're told from the beginning, this is who this man is. And then he spends the rest of the book confirming what he said in the very, very beginning. No talks of birth or childhood like the others, no explanation of God in the flesh. It's simply, here's this man and here's who he is. Let me tell you what he has done. I think it makes sense that this is a historical retelling to these people instead of maybe some great theological work or theme like in John's case. So anyway, the magic word for this book, and I think it was brought up maybe by Sterling in lesson 1, the idea of authority in this book. Thinking back to who the readers or the time the readers were in, were getting this, why do you think the idea of authority would be so big? I love when you ask me if that's what I'm talking about. I never know either. No, Sharon's point, the authority being established through Christ himself, essentially having to come in and set himself up in this way. And we do see that early. I mean, as early as chapter 1 and 2, when even just the way he taught was different. And so let's take that and take a step further. It was different how, right? If it's different, it has to be different from something. In terms of comparison, what was he being compared to?
The other teachers of the day.
Yeah, the other teachers of the day. And in terms of who they were, there's like 4 or 5 groups. How were those people viewed within the community at large? Yeah, their purpose, their role, their profession for some was to be the mouthpiece of the law, essentially. To share what it said, to interpret it, probably past the level they should have. But that was who they were. And that has been established over years and years and years, because think back to the last time in the Old Testament where we saw God directly speaking to his people. So much has changed. So much time has passed since God was directly speaking to some mouthpiece for the people. And so they've heard these stories of Moses and Elijah and whomever, and now they're like, wait a second, this guy's talking like he's got a direct line to the guy upstairs. And immediately red flags are going off. And so just in this book alone, it's not one of those ones where you just see the word authority a lot, and that's why we know it's important. We take it from his actions. How he announces the kingdom in chapter 1. He is, again, introduced quite quickly, and as he's establishing or beginning his mission, he just says, the kingdom is at hand. This bold proclamation of things are changing. And then again, stuff that maybe seems normal to us because we've read it. The fact that he's calling dudes out of boats and is like, yep, follow me. Leave your family, leave your profession. This makes sense. It's because he's coming in with this authority and how he's presenting himself and the reason he's there. You see authority in how he performs miracles, whether that's in talking to the demons whether that is commanding people to stay silent, which is another really interesting kind of through line through this book. You see it in how he speaks of the old law. And we talked about that with the traditions. We talked about that with the leaders of the day. He spoke about them not as someone who was interpreting, but as someone who could essentially say, yes, I said that. This is what it means. Or this is how it's being incorrectly taken and used. And then also the authority in how he forgives sins, which again, to us seems normal because it's Jesus, but to them seemed insane. The guy does not get called, essentially, a blasphemer attributing his power from Satan unless he was doing something wild. And he was coming saying that he was forgiving people's sins with no sacrifice to be found, no crazy traditions and rules, simply forgiving sins. Again, in our mind, normal because of who it is. To them, earth-shattering. And then finally, the three chunks of this book that I think stick out to me the most, you also see his authority in how he talks about what's about to happen. We see three near parallel stories in how he's sharing with the disciples and those around exactly what's going to happen. And eventually more details find their way in there. But he tells them where he's going, who's going to betray him, he's going to die, who's behind it, and that he's going to raise from the dead. 3 times he says this. They don't listen. It doesn't quite set. But even the authority to say, I know exactly what's coming. This is all in my control. The one who sent me here has put a plan in motion, and these people may think they're the ones behind the driver's seat, but I promise you, you don't get it. There's authority in every bit of Jesus in this book. And I think it's so interesting to see, because you still see the love and the compassion and the mercy, the human of him, but you also see the Son of God in that authority. And so, too small on the very last class. You see a couple different ways that Jesus is described in this book. And I think it's interesting, not only the names, but who refers to him in that way. So the first one you see is Son of David. 2 instances, kind of. Blind Bartimaeus for sure. And then in the triumphal entry, kind of how they speak of him. What does it say about Jesus to be called the Son of David? What are they essentially claiming about him?
David was significant to the people. Very significant.
Very significant in his role as the king. So you're seeing the royalty there maybe, but there's also more to David. What was promised of the line of David? Right, so we also have not just a call to maybe his title, but also the royal lineage spiritually that he has to come from. And so the fact that you're seeing this title be used as he's making his entry to essentially take his throne, and also from a blind man who is falling before him, trying to get him to save him. This recognition of, you're not just some man with power, I know who you are. I know where you are from, and I know what you're here to do. So you have the Son of David aspect, but you also have the Son of God, and I think this might be one of my favorite little weird things I've found in the book. The Son of God, which I think is probably what we would use the most, that's probably the most common. If we're talking about Jesus in our day, in our view, I don't think we jump to Son of David. I don't think we jump to Son of Man. Son of God, that one's a little bit more common in our vernacular. But this is a title only used to describe him by one living human in the entire book, and it's a centurion, a Roman, the one who did not grow up hearing of this Son of God to come. Simply a man who witnesses what happens at his death and proclaims, truly, this is the Son of God. And then the only other time we find it in the book is when the demon-possessed people are essentially blown away by who is in front of them, and they please, Son of God, either spare me, send me to a pig, whatever. They know exactly who he is. And that's early in the book. But by the end of the book, even people with no knowledge of the old law realize that this man is special and that he's the Son of God. And then finally, as the text continues to shrink, Son of Man. And this one's interesting because this is the one that Jesus uses to describe himself. So if you're looking at if Jesus is to pick one, this is the one he used. And he used it in many different ways. He used it when talking about the authority he had to forgive sins. He used it talking about himself when he was correcting them on the Sabbath in the old law. And I think it's so cool that this is the one he also uses when he's looking ahead at what's to come, when he talks about the Son of Man coming back. And the incredibly amazing picture of what's to come right after describing what the Son of Man is about to go through, being rejected and tortured and crucified. And I think it's so interesting that Son of Man is the way he describes himself. And maybe that's just me. But if I were in that position, I think the Son of God thing might be the one that I gravitate towards a little more. Yet instead it's I was born of Mary. I am living on this earth in the same form of those that I created, because if I wasn't in this form, this would all be for nothing. If he truly was not a Son of Man living here on this earth, the temptations would mean nothing. The sacrifice would mean nothing. That is what provided the weight. And that's how he continued to refer to himself. The title that maybe didn't have the weight of the others, but it's the one that he chose over and over again. So, before we get to our questions for the last 15 minutes, the book of Mark. It announces and confirms that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. It tells us that his death and resurrection were a part of the plan, and it shows us why we're to follow him and how to do it. So hopefully, again, going through this book has been enjoyable for you all. Hopefully, you've picked up on stuff maybe you haven't before, and it'll become something that maybe makes its way into the regular rotation in your studies moving forward. So, time for me to shut up, time for you all to talk. So, been pretty good about not forcing conversation up until this point, but it's my last class, so I'm going to. Got some questions. They're all on the board. I am going to give you all 5 minutes. Take some time, read the questions, think about your answers. I know not everyone is a talk in the group type of person. That is A-okay. But take some time to think these over. And then we're going to just spend the last 10 minutes class kind of going through these. And I want to hear from you all, maybe what you all took from the class. So feel free to think these over, flip through if you need to. And if you're visiting with us, I'm very sorry, but thank you. Yeah.
I've said this in many classes. Oh, and I might have new listeners. I just can't understand why, when he raised the dead, give blind sight to the blind, all the miracles that only God can do, people still do not give in that he's the Son of God. There was plenty when they saw his power that wanted to get in front of him and use his power. Of course, the scribes and the Pharisees and the people that were in high places, they didn't want to give up their position to the Son of God. And they were about to accept it. But I don't understand why that the common man, and probably most of the common people that really truly believe it, will after what he can give them less than tongues.
Yeah, it is. I think we've actually hit that a good bit in this class. I'm not going to try to restate all of that, but we've talked so much about what was on display, and we're halfway through the book when the Pharisees and them are saying, "If only you would give us a sign," right? It showed the true heart of the matter, and he kind of opened up by talking about being rejected in his own home, being viewed as just the son of Joseph, and yeah, this book is full of conventional wisdom being thrown out when it comes to who believes and who doesn't. Going back to the lesson that I taught not long ago about kind of those with such great knowledge seem to be those that struggled so much with their faith, and at times almost the inverse being true. Yes, sir.
I think one thing that needs to be said, and I expected it on your authoritative slide, when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if Matthew and Luke disagree over something, a timeline or whatever, Mark will agree with one or the other. And I think that points toward the authoritative thrust of the book that Mark is the one to answer if there's a discrepancy. I'm not saying that there's a doctrinal discrepancy between Matthew and Luke, certainly not. But Mark will agree with one or the other if there is a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And my slide definitely was more towards Jesus's authority, less about the authority of the book itself, which Sterling did a really good job covering kind of right at the beginning there. So totally agree with you on that point. So let's get to the first one. So how has this class changed your perspective on the Gospel of Mark? Who wants to kick us off? All right, Sterling.
Yeah, some of your comments that you made earlier was right. And I don't know that Mark is necessarily now my favorite.
Oh, sure. That'd be a lot to ask. So
That'd be a long way to go. But I think certainly an appreciation of Mark, and I think certainly thinking about what he was trying to do, the time frame he was trying to do it, and being the first one out with a message that was for the masses really helps kind of establish the importance of that.
yeah, kind of summarizing, realizing the value of what Mark's message was supposed to accomplish, fitting it within the timeline of when it came out and who it was for, and appreciating, I guess, the intention behind how he went about a lot of that. So who else has a changed perspective on this book? Maybe you haven't. If that's the case, keep that one to yourself. Yes, ma'am. the connection to Peter and kind of understanding the background that kind of maybe adjusted or informed his view of a lot of that. Yeah, definitely an interesting one. Any others for question 1? Good, it wasn't a good, oh, yes, sir. No, I think that is a phenomenal point. Using Mark as an entryway in teaching Christ to somebody. And that honestly was one of my big takeaways too from this class of, what we're trying to convey through our teaching. We don't have to have a full genealogy to track every connection he had to someone else to make this grand point of, no, like you can start by saying, let me tell you about this man and who he is. And let me read through this with you, explaining who he was, why he was here, how his life was different than everyone else's, and why that matters. I love that idea. Let's go with the second question. What would you say is the theme of the book, or maybe what's Mark's point here? And you can take something we've talked about already, or you can kind of put your own spin on it. What do you take away from this? If someone was going to ask you, what is Mark, right? What is it? Yes, sir. Yeah, Drell basically said the quintessential gospel in terms of it is the breaking news story where someone is trying to get the word out as quick as possible. And I'll be very short on this tangent. One of the most interesting things to me in studying the history of the book is many people within like the greater religious community discarded Mark and said that it was simply a summarization of the other two. And it wasn't until more and more historical data came out to realize exactly what Darrell is saying. It wasn't this late addition to summarize the first. It was, no, we need to get this out here. And the other two then expound on that with additional info or clarifying info. But that was what this was. This was, we need to get the gospel out there. I think that's a great way of looking at the book. Anything else on this book? Yes, sir.
He was the king who came to serve.
Oh, so succinct and good. Yeah. A servant king, a king who came to serve. And that is, Mark is just full of Jesus not sleeping, traveling nonstop, and doing nothing of his own desires, but constantly serving and helping others. And a lot of the times, those that needed it the most. And those that didn't always maybe get the attention, especially within that day and age. Yes, Sterling.
We have to put that in context of that day. So probably one of the most famous verses in Mark emphasizes that, where
Yeah, and not only that he came to serve, which was so different, it was also who he chose to serve. And I think that's something else in this book of people who you wouldn't be caught with. No one who just touching them would make you unclean. The amount of women who show incredible faith, which again to us may be normal, but back then would have been the outlier within the story. It is a retelling of Jesus serving those who it didn't do him any good to serve. It's just out of love and humility, and again, the example that's being set for us. All right, jump into the third question, and I'll go ahead and kick this one off. For me, the story that I have not been able to get out of my head going through Mark is in Mark chapter 12, the parable of the tenants. And the reason is, I think, parables, a lot of times you kind of just remember what they are and what you're supposed to learn from it. But I think there's something really powerful about realizing the context in which a parable takes place. Looking at how these God-fearing religious leaders are coming after him, and he takes the time to share this parable with them, essentially calling them out in this incredible story, essentially telling the history of God's people, going back from Moses all the way throughout. Looking at all the messengers that God sent over and over and over before finally sending the son of the owner, and how they're treated. That's one story that really has hit home with me as we've gone through this book. What are some stories that maybe have stuck with you? Yeah, Terry. Yeah, that's a wonderful one. Who else says something? Yes, ma'am.
One thing that speaks to me is the rich young ruler,
Mm-hmm.
the rich young man. This country is incredibly well off. And I don't mean there aren't poor people, and maybe some desperately poor people. But on the whole, our life is with all the technology that we have and all the opportunities and the jobs, and I think we take it for granted so much and don't share enough sometimes. I'm speaking for my own.
No, I'm with you. The rich young ruler is one that stomps on my toes regularly and kind of puts things into perspective. Thank you guys so much again for all the participation through the last 4 months. Sterling will be teaching on something awesome Sunday, so be ready for that. And I know he'll deliver as always. Thank you guys.